Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Clearing the Air on Agricultural Policy, a presentation of the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy. This is a monthly spin-off of the popular podcast known as Smoke and Mirrors, Ag Policy Unfiltered, which is hosted by one of our panel members, whom you'll hear from in just a moment. Today's topic is reflecting on an effort from 20-some years ago and its relevance today pertaining to agricultural policy, the Commission on 21st Century Production Agriculture. That was a commission, by the way, chaired by the namesake of our center, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Before we introduce our special guest to address that topic today, a quick rundown of our regular panelists who are taking part here. Jennifer Ift is an associate professor and extension specialist and the Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at Kansas State University, also the host of that weekly podcast, Smoke and Mirrors, Ag Policy Unfiltered. Also with us, Brad Lubin, associate extension professor and agricultural and public policy specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and professor emeritus and longtime agriculture and rural policy specialist at Iowa State University, Mark Edelman. We'll hear from Brad and Mark in just a moment. This Commission on the 21st Century Production Agriculture was established in the 1996 Farm Bill. Its directive was to review the effective agriculture policies since the enhancement and enactment of the 1996 legislation and to undertake a comprehensive review. Also, importantly to us today, to recommend a course for future agricultural policies. We brought in to talk about the Commission's work and its pertinence today an individual who would well know all about that. He was the executive director on staff of the Commission on 21st Century Production Agriculture. Mickey Paggi is an agricultural policy analyst for National Crop Insurance Services currently, and we're happy to have him on board today. I will turn it over now to Jenny Ift to set the stage further with Mickey. So go ahead, Jenny.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Mickey, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like you to start off telling us a little bit about yourself, your career, and how you ended up working on the 21st Century Commission.
I guess I'll start at the beginning. I started working on PhD at A&M, and I was working with in the areas of transportation and international trade, extension and research. I got involved with Ron Knutson and some of the first images or versions of the Ag and Food Policy Center back when we were using TI 99 calculators and not computable general equilibrium models. So I'm not sure if it evolved to a better place or if it should have stayed with the TIs, but it's gone on to be something else. And that interaction led me to many exposures to Barry's wisdom and wit, as it were. And at A&M, I worked there for about 8 years. I was on the faculty, got my PhD, was on the faculty there for about 8 years. And then I moved to the American Farm Bureau Federation in Chicago as a senior economist. And I worked primarily for the next 8 years on the Uruguay round trade negotiations. Then we moved on to the NAFTA negotiations and all the things that went around with that. We were basically part of the private sector advisory group to the Trade Representative's Office during those efforts. And it was quite exciting, an optimistic time, which I'll reflect on in a minute. But for me, it had run its course, and I had an opportunity to go to Rome and work for the Food and Ag Organization of the UN. Went over there and worked for I was there for 4 years, I think. And that was a unique experience, particularly because of the period in time. And I was part of the tropical products, horticultural products, environmental issues group. And that was quite an experience. But at one point, I had the opportunity to come back to the States and work at USDA as national program leader for resource and environmental programs for the National Extension Group. And so I did that, came back, and I was working in that position when Barry approached me about the commission and said, hey, what do you think about this? At the time, I hadn't been in the other job very long, and I was a little leery of jumping ship, as it were, as I already had traveled a bit, as it were. But I got in there and interviewed and visited with Keith and Joe Glauber at the time. One thing led to another, and sure enough, he hired me to be the executive director. That's basically where I got hooked up with Barry and the commission. When it was over, I went on to the budget office and then out to California and ran the Center for Food and Agriculture at CSU Fresno for about 16 years. And I've been doing all of this with the help of my senior research economist slash wife, who is slash equestrian slash brains of the outfit. So it's been a teamwork, and she was a foil to some of Barry's wit, as it were, over the years. So it was a family affair, we'll put it that way. And now I'm working as a consultant to the national crop insurance industry. And anything I say here is my opinion. It doesn't have any reflection on NCIS policy.
Absolutely. That's quite a career, and I have heard Barry appreciated a good foil.
He did that.
Could you give us some more details about what the First Century Commission was?
Yeah, I think Eric gave a good introduction. A couple of things about it that uh, are important, because it's my understanding that some folks are thinking about moving into this direction as a possible activity for the group. It was a heck of an undertaking. The things that we were asked to do were broad and written in the authorizing legislation, but it was up to us to come up with what we really, what is it? How do you do what they asked us to do, basically? So we went under Barry's direction, and I mean, one of the things that I always enjoyed about him was this idea of, you don't want to make policy. You want to give people both sides of the issue, and with enough information that they can go forward and make the policy decision on their own. And that was always the way he approached stuff. So I think the commission reflects that. The report reflects that sort of view of how to go about policy work in general. You'll also notice that it had dissenting opinions. So we were, in that day and age, bipartisanship and the ability to recognize alternative views was something that was embraced, which I'll speak to in a moment concerning the current environment, which is a little bit different, it seems. But I think, just to get started, we had 11 members, and that's kind of important, how they were apportioned. 3 were picked to serve on the commission by the president, who at that point was Bill Clinton. You got to remember, this was right in the transition. They could have, the commission came about through the 96 Farm Bill, which was a transition period or a watershed moment, or could have been if, if things had worked out a little differently, I think. But anyway, it also was a transition between Clinton and Bush. So we had a political dynamic going on that was somewhat different than recent years, maybe. But we had 3 members that were appointed by the president, 4 that were appointed by the chairman of the House Ag Committee, and 4 that were appointed by the chairman of the Senate Ag Committee. And that group of individuals, I'll just run through it real quick because I think it's important. Barry was the chair, of course, but we had Bruce Brumsfield, who was a gentleman's gentleman, Mississippi cotton and catfish farmer. We had the late great Bill Northey, who was a friend of everybody's and just a heck of a guy. Passed way too soon. John Campbell, a Nebraska Ag Producers Incorporated entrepreneur, who's now, last I heard, in Omaha, I believe, and working for some sort of conglomeration of ag investment. The last he explained it to me, but maybe not. Ralph Page, wonderful gentleman from Georgia. He was head of the Federation of Southern Co-ops. In a lot of ways, this group was, and some extent Barry's legacy, embraced a bit of the uh, diversity, equity, and inclusion group, because the small farms and the less advantaged community was served very well by Ralph's presence of the commission. There was always a consideration for that group, uh, which might have been ahead of its time, as it were. A fellow named Don Cook, who was with Pendleton Grain years ago, a big part of the agricultural community out in the state of Oregon. Jim Dupree, a big rice farmer from Arkansas. We referred to Jim as a friend of Bill's. He and Bill Clinton went way back, and that didn't hurt either, having him around. Leland Swenson, from South Dakota, who was head of the National Farmers Union. Leland, I can't, unfortunately, a number of these folks are no longer with us. And Leland is one that I believe passed away, but I can't verify that. So if he didn't, I apologize. Charlie Cruz, Farm Bureau president from Missouri, great grad, corn, soybean farmer. Charlie's still around. It was good to have people like Charlie around, because they had the Farm Bureau president viewpoint, but he was also a farmer, and very much gave you the producer input. And then finally, last but not least, Dan Villois, who I understand is now a board member. I think that's right. He's a good one. Let's put it that way. Popcorn farmer from Indiana. He's got as much background and institutional knowledge as probably anyone around. It goes back that far, he can still remember. So it was a good group. It was one that was appointed with some degree of, of focus on where they came from and who was appointing them. So we had a balance of the Republicans, the Democrats, the also Rams, sort of. So it was a very good mixture, as it were. But I think it was a product of the times. We forget sometimes, I think, about the period that we were going into. I don't. You've got people like Dan Glickman, who was Clinton's Secretary of Agriculture. We dealt with Dan, and Dan was a great friend of Barry's, and a lot of what got done early on was because Barry and Dan got along so well, and Clinton basically said, just go do whatever you want there. And Dan said, Barry, do whatever you want. And it was a very clubbish sort of atmosphere across the aisle. And then when Bush took over, Ann Veneman came in as Secretary of Ag, and Ann was again a friend of mine from her days as California Department of Agriculture Secretary, and Barry got to have a very good relationship with Ann, so that worked out very good. And then on the House side, we had Larry Combest, and Charlie Stenholm was the ranking member on the House Ag Committee. And then on the Senate side, we had Richard Lugar, and Pat Leahy was the ranking member. And then at one point, Tom Harkin came in toward the end. So it was a cast of characters, that's for sure. I think, when you look at what came out of it, it was forward looking, I think, which was one of the things that Barry wanted to do. But it was 26 years ago. So that was then, this is now.
Absolutely. Well, as a scholar of agricultural policy, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in there. I would like to be explicit, though, for, say, a broader group. So thinking about producers, people that work for agribusinesses, other researchers, the general public. Why should people care about what the 21st Century Commission did?
Well, it's a good question. I think one, probably from my own perspective, it's one of these cases where if you don't remember your history, you're going to be woefully repeat it, and the mistakes that you repeat. And I think especially if one thinks about embarking on an exercise like this in the future, you have to remember where you are in space and time, because that was part of the key to this particular exercise. And if people want to think about going forward, they need to look and take a look backward. And by that, I mean, this was 2000, 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000. These were periods of optimism, in my opinion, having lived through it. We had just done the Uruguay round, which was a massive undertaking, and it was successful, and everybody was exports were booming, prices were going up, everything looked good. It's time for change. North American Free Trade Agreement, everything. This is going to work. Went into the '96 Farm Bill, watershed sorts of changes. We got away with acreage reduction programs. We went into a fixed payment method. We were going to decouple. We were going to be okay with the WTO. The road goes on to forever, and the party never ends. Right up until it did. And I went back and I did a bunch of stuff looking at '96. Sure enough, we were on an upward trajectory for prices. Everything was looking good, and the market crashed. So did the willpower of that optimistic legislative body, the House and Senate. Immediately, they moved into an ad hoc program where they just pumped dollars into the system. To, in this case, and I'll make a distinction, even though I probably shouldn't, I should keep my mouth shut. But in this case, it was actually income support to bail out farmers from what they saw was a temporary market disruption. It was ad hoc in the best of ways. It wasn't buying votes for a midterm election. It wasn't putting 25 billion, but it was an indication that this experiment in freedom to farm, this change in our policy, wasn't going to work. Uh, you just you got criticisms on the way in because they were getting AMPTA payments, these fixed payments for previous base level production in times where prices were going up. So you got critics on the right going, "You're spending money, they don't need money, they're making money on the market, blah blah blah." And you got critics on the left going, "No, this is how you do it. Now they don't have to worry about the government program. They know they've got a payment coming. They can watch the market. They can plant for what they want. This is the best of both worlds." We'll never know because it didn't last long enough to come into fruition. And part of what we did was working in that space was to try to go through as thoroughly as possible all the policies that were in place and comment on their relevance or what might be better, and then make some suggestions for how things might want to change. Then we went into very specific things depending on what element of the policy we wanted to talk. And that's a fairly long discussion.
So it sounds like, it was the right time. You had the right people that put it into place, that Barry was able to get a lot of different voices on it to make it happen. Could you cover some of the key recommendations and maybe give us a little look backwards? What do you think the commission got right, or then maybe something that didn't work out?
Yeah, I think the key findings we came off sort of big shoddy and came out with the goals for ag policy because one of the things that's always I've been doing this a while, and one of the things that's always bothered me was there's no objective function, or if there is, it's elusive, and so everybody tries to develop why are we even doing this. We came up with the goals being to produce an abundant supply of high quality food fiber at reasonable prices, maintain a prosperous, productive economic climate for the farmers, preserve the family farm as a central component to U.S. agriculture, and ensure high quality. So that ain't nobody can argue with that, I don't think. Sounds good. Problem is how you do that. You can go through, there's lots of stuff, but if you look at the recommendations for farm income support, we as a group uh, agreed that the AMPTA payments should continue. I think it was a consensus of the group that although they carped about it at the first, the '96 Farm Bill was the way to go. I mean, that was the initial feeling. that we continue the AMTA program, decoupling and let the market become more important in terms of decisions. We also had an idea of creating a supplemental income support program that provided countercyclical uh, payments based on crop income, based on some historical reference. And again, this was to continue that decoupling idea where, okay, we've got your fixed payment, and we realize that that may or may not be enough. So we need a counter-cyclical payment that can come in and top it off as you continuing the market assistance loans. And then there was this idea that you just eliminate payment limitations because they're not constraining loans. I mean, mostly there's a way to get around most of them that exist, but Mississippi Christmas tree example continues to be used. Um, so I think that those were ideas that seemed to be viable at the time they were created. The idea that we had that I think, I hate to say this, but the one that really had legs was the idea that we had with regard to risk management. And that's where we introduced the idea of an actuarially sound private sector crop revenue insurance program. Basically, the RP program that we have today. Nobody envisioned what crop insurance became at that period of time. I mean, we knew it was important. We knew that this was a good idea, but boy, did it take off. Today, crop insurance is the part safety net. We'll see how the changes to ARC and PLC kick in the coming year. We've really, I mean, the crop insurance idea, especially revenue protection, has really, that was one that stuck. That took off. The next idea, not so much, farm savings account. And this idea, there's nothing new under the sun. And this is kicked around, gosh, I want to say 85 Farm Bill. There was something like this. It was an idea that people could tax defer some of their income for a certain amount of time so that they would have their own sort of self-insurance idea. But there was also this idea that a time limit needed to be attached to it because there was a fear that it would cause some volatility in the financial markets. But that's the idea that didn't go anywhere. To my knowledge, I don't even hear it being talked about now. And they figured out a way to give money for everything now. So that farm account would just be a piece of paper. The conservation stuff we looked at, it's what we do. And a lot of this, you ask why would you want to look at this? It's instructive to simply go back and look at what we were talking about and realize that's exactly what we're doing now. The same thing. Buffer strips, filter strips, wetlands, grass waterways, partial field erosion, carbon sequestration, manure management, greenhouse gas. It's the same stuff, alternative fuel. And in trade policy, it's basically, we had a better understanding of trade policy then than we have now, in my humble opinion, because we were talking about things that had to do with single undertaking in a multilateral negotiation, which was critical. It meant don't cut cotton out and keep it away from soybeans. It's a single undertaking. Well, we didn't learn that lesson, but we were thinking in that direction with a much more nuanced view of how things work because we were so close to it. We just finished it, uh, and granting the president trade negotiation authority or fast track or what do they call it now? Something else I forget, but it's which I don't believe the current president has. I don't think he does. They still need to do that if they wish to go. Laws are so much more fungible now than they were, evidently. We understood that in a lot of these programs and policies, there's a chance that you can deviate into these multiple objectives away from what a program really should be doing. So we interjected that, this is about trade, tariffs, non-tariff barriers. It's not about labor. It's not about the environment. Don't try to make trade policy do something it's not supposed to do because you want something else. So don't let the perfect be the victim of the practical. And then we went, we even dabbled so far as to go into the dairy, peanuts, and sugar programs, but those are things that didn't work out so well. They're just different, and they've been different since, for the 40 something years I've been doing this. They've been different, and they're still different. So we didn't do much to make any tobacco. We didn't do much good on that. But I think that's the value of this stuff, is that you can go back and see what we were thinking, and then the striking, I think, is how similar it is to the same issues we're dealing with. It's maybe comforting to some, but alarming to others. You would think that it just keeps rolling down the road. So it's a valuable piece just from knowing where you've been before you. I mean, you got to know where you've been and where you want to go to figure out how to get there. I think I'm just glad I didn't throw all this stuff away.
And I definitely encourage folks out there to go and read it. It's interesting. The income support looks an awful lot like ARG. And some of the suggestions for crop insurance, on the other hand, would have given us something quite different than what we had today. I'd also say if you look at that time period from after the commission till about 2018, that was a period of, I'd say, policy stability for the safety net. Most of the policy was predictable. We're sort of in an ad hoc era now. And with that, I'd like to open this up for a broader discussion.
Indeed. Mark and Brad, just pipe in here with whatever you have to share. Mark, actually, you were involved in the testimonial process, if I'm not mistaken, when the commission presented to Congress.
Well, you may recall the one area Mickey said that didn't go anywhere. But I provided testimony on the Canadian farm savings account concept.
Right.
And
Right, I remember.
did some in depth of that. But yeah, there was a number of reasons why it didn't take off, I think, and the crop insurance at that point in time was really something that ended up being the high profile part of what moved forward. And I don't sour grapes in the whole process. That was just, I did get a journal article out of it, so that was a positive thing. But I did want to ask and Mickey to give a sense, since he was involved with the Uruguay round and in tune with the development of what ended up being the World Trade Organization. What is your sense about the future of that organization? Is there a role for sort of a rules-based world trading system? And how do we negotiate or think about even negotiating the blocks that seem to be forming or a system that's evolving today?
You remember Swikert, the dairy extension guy from Michigan, I think?
Michigan State.
Great guy. Passed away again way too soon. He and I looked at this question long time ago, and what we came away with, he and someone else actually published a paper. And what happened with the WTO is, I work for the United Nations as well. And what you find out is that stuff works. It worked really good when the blocks were well defined. You had the EU, you had the US, you had Japan, and then you had others. Now there's 134 different countries all wanting something special and differential for their particular way of looking at it. You've got the group of four. You broke out the African cotton people, which ruined the single undertaking idea, which made everything more complicated. The WTO suffers from the same thing that the FAO suffers from. Well-intentioned body of people with too many special interests vying for a small pie, and everybody wants a larger share, and it just stagnates. Now we've got China, we've got India, Africa to some extent. It's just, I think its success became its own sort of problem. There's too many folks trying to make rules, and everybody wants a special rule for themselves. So that having the system's a good idea, but boy, it's more difficult to work now.
Mickey, to that sense, you described one of the challenges in WTO is that it's a consensus body.
Exactly.
It requires unanimous agreement to move anywhere. The Farm Bill is not a consensus product, but it still requires a majority, which is typically required bipartisan support in both chambers. What do you see as the prospects for farm legislation and debate in Congress to move forward? Or is that stuck too in a sort of partisan framework that doesn't work?
If you back up to the period I was talking about when the commission came into reality, and you fast forward to the last 5 years here, very similar. Prices were skyrocketing up. Looks like things are going to work. Things are going to work. Boom. And then the sort of changes in the policies that were instituted in this new administration created havoc, and the answer was to inject a bunch of income support directly into the sector to compensate for losses that they were incurring that basically were government related in terms of the policy impacts of what was going on in the trade sector with all the tariffs. You can't point your fingers at what the problem is. It's a very similar dynamic. We've gone from a market oriented agriculture back to ad hoc disaster assistance. And I know Mark remembers this, and Brad as well. I mean, there was a time when the way you got reelected in West Texas was to ride into town on a white horse with a big bag of money and throw it around. And here we go again. I mean, it's again, the value of the past is not to repeat the problems in the future, and we don't seem to be very good at that. So I'm pretty pessimistic. Now, something may change. I don't see any bipartisan anything. All I see is partisan bickering back and forth, pointing fingers, and the road forward. I just don't have a crystal ball that I can see into. It's just there's too much uncertainty in too many different venues to think that we can move something forward. That you mentioned earlier the important role that this nonpartisan coalition, the food people and the agriculture people, that linkage is broken, in my opinion, with what happened to SNAP. And when that happens, let's see if what our doom machine had always said, because once that link is broken, you're going to have a hard time getting stuff through anything because you need those votes. You know how many people are rural now? That used to be one step back. Now it's a far distance where you've got people in Congress that honestly think milk comes from Safeway. I mean, that's a bit trivial, but you know what I'm saying. It's much more of a disconnect now than it used to be, and it's getting more and more that way. I mean, God forbid, we just had our first grandbaby, male, got two little girls. But when I think about those kids, what they're going to see in the next 20 years, I don't know. I'm less optimistic than I used to be, but I'm getting older now, so I realize that that's just the way old people behave. How in the world can they ever do anything? Well, that's what we do. We kick the can down the road. So,
Mickey, with all that said, then, do you perceive that there might be value in resurrecting the concept of a bipartisan commission, or at least a broad-based commission, to discuss the lay of the land in agriculture policy today once more, in the hopes of maybe pushing toward bipartisanship and more functional farm policy, if you will?
Eric, I'm glad you asked that because it's my understanding. Let me just say this before I go off on a tangent. I think if it's something that folks think they want to do, what I think the lesson from what we did is this is really a hard thing to do. We were able to do it because of the grace of Keith Collins, his remarkable staff, his folks working with him like Joe Glauber, the lady that was his secretary, Jeannie. We could not have done it without all these people working together and thinking it was a good idea and they gave us offices. They took care of the bookkeeping. They took care of we had 60 different professors and professionals testifying across 11 different meeting places, and all this stuff was arranged through Keith's office. And, there were almost no constraints. So what I'm kind of trying to get to is the best way to do this may very well this time around not be legislative mandate. I don't think you want a senator from the state of blank intervening to get monies allocated through legislation to develop a commission like this. Rather, it would seem to me this time around, if that's what you want to do, then you need to concentrate first on how much is an effort this is going to be in terms of logistics, just simple logistics. And then how do you staff this thing? How do you get money for it? So you go to this is me thinking out loud. I'd be concentrating on developing a large group, or not a large group, 11, 12 people that represent farm organizations, that represent commodity organizations, that represent input supply, that represents credit. I mean, it's not, it's not difficult to sit down with the group in front of me right now and figure out, and it doesn't take a village to figure this out, but you need input supply. All the sectors of the ag economy, grab people that represent the best and the brightest of those views and get it to be a industry backed commission rather than a legislative, because, and this, I'm a curmudgeon of sorts, but I'm also been around long enough to watch this. You ain't going to get a bipartisan anything out of this group. Everybody that goes in with an appointment through Congress is going to have an angle. I just tell it like it is. I mean, maybe we'll get back to some civility. I don't know, but it just seems toxic to me to try to group in this environment to go about this through a legislative angle. To me, if you went through an industry angle, you've got better support. You don't have a political bias one way or the other. Or if you do, if you get National Farmers Union and AFBF together, you're going to have a political angle on either side of the party line. But what you want to do is not have it staffed with commissioners that are MGA and liberal. I mean, this I think would work better as an industry sponsored group that comes out and say, look, here, we don't, Midwest soybean people don't like Texas cotton farmers for a lot of reasons, but we're all in agriculture and we all want to make this better. The Florida tomato growers don't like the California tomato growers. We conflict against ourselves, and we need to get back to understanding that you have to think about the good of the sector, and that might take some compromising on what you want for your individual commodity group or whatever, however you fit into the system. And that to me is something that I think you really ought to think hard about, because while it might look easier to go the legislative route, being we got our money, we got somebody at K-State or somebody anywhere that's going to run this thing. We'll pull together. The other thing is, God forbid you pull a bunch of academics in. Please, please get research extension people. Don't really need CGE people talking about this stuff. We need to get it down to a level that people understand, and it makes kind of basic logic sense, not econometric nonsense. Excuse me. Didn't mean that. I mean,
No one's going to argue here with that.
the complexity of analysis does not necessarily make it better analysis. So let's put it that way. In the policy framework, for sure. But I'm all for it. I think, the more you can do to get visibility for the center, and to get visibility and to continue to get Barry's ideas out there and his methodology, or however you want to call it, his way of doing things, as it were. Yeah, it worked once.
Mickey, go back to how it worked the first time around. I recall that, as you described it earlier, the group was broad based. It certainly did have different viewpoints, but it was collegial and it actually came to consensus on many issues. There was also respect for the diversity of opinion, and I recall there were even minority statements as part of the report.
Yep.
The current reality or the current concern is, can people actually still come to consensus if they meet in a supportive and open framework, or are we stuck with only defending our pre-existing positions and perceptions and not able to produce something in consensus?
Well, I think the likelihood of that success would be greater if the group was taken out of the industry side of the business, for lack of a better description, as opposed to the legislative side of the business, because I think you're more likely to get a consensus among like-minded members of the ag sector across functions like credit and insurance and what have you, because they see the system as a whole. And a holistic view of the system is necessary to understand why it works as well as it works, even though it kind of doesn't look like it's working real good all the time. But I mean, it's get it if you get the composition dictated through some sort of attempt to balance it in a legislative sense, Dems versus Rs or what have you, I don't think you ever get a consensus. Not in this environment. I mean, as you say, and you saw we didn't all agree on everything, but we agreed on most of it. And if you violently didn't agree, then you had the right to make a dissent and have it be heard. And that's collegiality. And that's what we had. I would hope it's back. I would hope you could get it through the industry group. I would hope you could get it the other way, but I think the realities of today's world are somewhat different than we were dealing with. I don't sense that optimism and spirited core that we had.
To what extent back then compared to today? I guess one of the big changes that's kind of occurred since the commission was the whole development of biofuels, and today we're kind of looking at, in addition to trade, we're looking at things like sustainable aviation fuel, green marine fuel, and things of that to expand the agriculture. To what extent is that just a regional concern? I mean, and industry focus that would kind of underscores why industry involvement would be important in a future commission.
Mark, it saddens me because John Campbell was on the cusp of the biofuels and ethanol group. He was probably the only one of the group that saw that because he was involved in it at a small level. But when I look and trade's been my deal all my life until I went into the dark side of crop insurance. This idea that we are going to go back to a dominant supplier in world markets ignores the reality of what's going on. And that's our friends in Brazil can overdo everything at a less cost. We're no longer the low cost supplier of almost anything. We're dangerously close to being not a reliable supplier of anything because we don't know how that's going to work. I just think that the development of domestic demand, particularly for soybeans, is critical, and corn as well. And the only thing that seems to work on that is biofuels, either biodiesel or sustainable aviation fuel, E15, E85, whatever you want to say about it. That seems to be the next road to try to build demand, because I think that the export opportunities have sort of left the building. The other thing is when you crush that many soybeans to make that much biofuel stock, you develop a whole lot of soybean meal. And that's good for the people that feed it, but it's bad for the people that make it and try to sell it. So, I mean, you've got On one hand this, on the other hand that. And sustainable aviation fuel, I don't know. It's you can do it. You can make it work, but it is not an easy way to do it. I mean, especially if you care about lowering the CI on the feedstock. You've got to get rid of the CO2 coming out of the ethanol plants. You got to pipe it in somewhere and store it in an abandoned gas well. I don't know if there's anything like induced innovation. I'd be looking for another fuel source to replace these things that are too hard to go. And then there goes your soybean market and your corn market. So I mean, it's now you've got a hydrogen fuel car. I don't know. It's but but to be sure, in any discussion going forward, you better have those biofuel people in the room because they're going to be a major player going forward, to be sure. And we'll figure out something to do with soybean meal. You can probably make bricks out of it or something. We'll figure out something. That's a good point, though, Mark.
This is a good stopping point. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make, Mickey, on the topic broadly?
I just encourage you to, go forth and do good things. It's certainly one avenue available to you as you think about development of the center that would give visibility and would do good to the industry. I think for people to sit down or at least try to sit down in a group and come up with a reasoned thinking to how we move forward, dealing with the new realities of trade, the new realities of the marketplace, with the influences of biofuels, competition from Brazil, and what are the promises of India. There's big questions out there that big minds need to be thinking about.
Very good. It's been enlightening. Mickey, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts here. Greatly appreciate it. With us today, Mickey Paggi. Mickey, formerly the executive director of the Commission for 21st Century Production Agriculture, now with National Crop Insurance Services. Thank him very much for his time today, as well as our panel from Iowa State University, Mark Edelman from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Brad Lubin, and from Kansas State University, Jenny Ift. Do check out our past podcasts, if you will, on clearing the air. That would be at flinchbaughcenter.com, flinchbaughcenter.com. Eric Atkinson here from Kansas State University. Thanks for listening in.